My father lifted his champagne glass and smiled like he was standing inside a life he had built with honest hands. "We gave Madison every opportunity," he said into the microphone, his voice warm and proud. "And she made us proud every step of the way." Around me, people applauded. Professors in navy blazers, my mother's friends from the country club, Madison's classmates in expensive dresses and polished shoes. The ballroom lights caught the gold trim on the banners above the dance floor. "Congratulations, Madison." Her name was everywhere. On the cake, on the photo wall, on the little custom napkins stacked beside the bar. I sat at table 11 in a dress I had bought off a clearance rack 3 days earlier, staring at a slideshow of my sister's life. Madison on move-in day at her private university. Madison in Barcelona with a glass of sangria. Madison in a cap and gown, smiling like the world had always made room for her. There wasn't one picture of me. Not in uniform. Not at graduation from my online program. Not even from when I came home after 6 years away. My father kept talking. "We made sacrifices, real sacrifices. But when you believe in your child, you do whatever it takes." That line landed like a bruise. Because 6 years earlier, when I sat at our kitchen table holding my college acceptance letter with both hands so they wouldn't see me shaking, those same parents had looked me in the face and said something very different. "We're giving everything to your sister. You'll have to find your own way." So I did. I found my own way in combat boots. I found it in 4 a.m. drills, in cold barracks, in online classes after long shifts, in learning how to stop expecting help from people who liked calling me strong only when it saved them money. Now Madison stood near the stage in a white sheath dress, one hand over her heart, pretending to cry at the speech she had heard versions of her whole life. My mother dabbed at her eyes. My father raised his glass higher. "And tonight," he said, smiling toward the crowd, "we celebrate the daughter who made our investment worth it." Something inside me went very still. Because at the back of the room, my 82-year-old grandmother had just pushed her chair back and started to stand. And when I looked at her face, I knew this wasn't going to stay a celebration. I knew, in that terrible, quiet way you know when your life is about to split in two. Have you ever sat in a room full of people and realized the truth was finally done waiting? My grandmother didn't rush. She never did. At 82, Eleanor Thomas moved slowly, but there was something about the way she stood that made the entire front row turn their heads. The soft clink of silverware against plates faded as people noticed her rising from her chair. My father noticed too. For a split second, his smile slipped. "Mom," he said lightly into the microphone, trying to keep the room relaxed, "we'll let Madison say a few words first." But my grandmother kept walking. Each step was careful, deliberate, the heel of her shoe tapping against the polished floor. The sound carried farther than it should have in a ballroom filled with more than 100 guests. Madison shifted beside the podium. "Grandma," she said, half laughing, "you're going to make me cry before I even start." No one else was laughing anymore. I felt Jake's hand lightly touch my elbow under the table. He had come as my +1, though technically we had only been dating 3 months. Still, he'd insisted on being there. "Something's happening," he murmured. "I know," I said quietly. My grandmother reached the front of the room and turned to face the crowd. Her posture was perfectly straight, pearls resting neatly at her collarbone, the same necklace she had worn at every major family event since I was a child. She looked first at Madison, then at my father. Then, finally, her eyes landed on me. There was something steady in that look. Not anger, not pity. Certainty. "Before anyone toasts," she said calmly, her voice clear enough that the microphone wasn't even necessary, "I think there's something important we need to correct." A ripple of confusion moved through the crowd. My mother stood up halfway from her chair. "Eleanor," she whispered sharply, "this isn't the time." My grandmother didn't even glance at her. Instead, she gestured toward the man standing a few steps behind her. Gray suit, leather briefcase. David Brennan. My grandfather's attorney. I felt the air leave my lungs. Jake leaned closer. "Is that a lawyer?" he asked under his breath. "Yes," I said. And suddenly, the cryptic phone call I had with my grandmother months earlier echoed in my mind. Some things aren't what they seem. David stepped forward and quietly placed a folder on the podium. My father stared at it like it was something dangerous. "What is this?" he asked. My grandmother answered without hesitation. "The truth about the college fund." The words landed like glass, shattering in a silent room. Madison blinked. "Grandma, what are you talking about?" My father laughed nervously. "Mom, this isn't the place." "Oh, Richard," my grandmother interrupted softly. "This is exactly the place." She turned to the room again. 28 years ago, my late husband and I created a trust for our two granddaughters. Every conversation in the ballroom had stopped. $200,000 for Kora, $200,000 for Madison. Equal distribution. Non-negotiable. Then, she lifted a single sheet of paper from the folder. "And yet," she said calmly, "Kora received nothing." The silence that followed was so complete you could hear someone drop a fork near the back wall. If you're listening to this story right now, I'm curious about something. Where are you watching from tonight? Drop your city or country in the comments. Because moments like this, when the truth finally stands up in a room full of lies, feel the same no matter where you are in the world. For a moment, no one moved. It was the kind of silence that doesn't feel empty. It feels heavy, like the entire room just realized it stepped into something much bigger than a graduation party. My father was the first to react. He laughed. Too quickly, too loudly. "Mom," he said, lowering the microphone a little, "you must be confused. The trust was family money. We already discussed this years ago." My grandmother didn't raise her voice. She didn't argue. She simply turned her head slightly toward David Brennan. That was enough. David opened his briefcase. The soft click of the latch sounded like a judge's gavel. Inside were several folders, thick with documents. He began walking table to table, handing them to people near the front, first Madison's professors, a few of my father's business associates, several relatives. "Please take a look," he said calmly. At my table, Jake opened the folder and slid it toward me. The first page was a copy of the original trust document. My grandfather's signature. My grandmother's signature. And one line underlined in blue ink. Equal distribution between beneficiaries. $200,000 each. Jake exhaled slowly. "This is pretty clear." Across the room, whispers started spreading. Paper rustled. People flipped pages. My father's face had gone pale. "Mom," he said, his voice tightening now, "you're embarrassing yourself." "No," my grandmother replied. "I'm correcting a lie." Madison stepped forward, her voice shaking. "Grandma, Dad told me you changed the trust, that you said it made sense to give everything to me because Kora had military benefits." My grandmother turned toward her, and for a second, her expression softened. "Oh, sweetheart," she said gently, "I never changed that trust." The room inhaled as one. My father slammed his hand on the podium. "That's enough," he snapped. "We'll discuss this privately." But David Brennan had already stepped beside the microphone. His voice carried with the calm authority of someone who had spent 40 years explaining uncomfortable facts in courtrooms. "The document you're holding," he said, gesturing toward the folders, "shows 6 years of withdrawals from the Thomas Family Education Trust." He paused. All funds were transferred to accounts associated with Madison Thomas's university tuition. Madison shook her head. "No, that can't be right." David continued. "The total withdrawn amount was $400,000. A murmur swept through the room. Someone near the back whispered, "Wait, wasn't that supposed to be split?" My grandmother answered them. "Yes." Then she looked straight at my father. "But Richard forged my signature to make it happen." The word forged cut through the ballroom like a blade. Gasps erupted across the room. My father didn't speak. He couldn't. Madison turned slowly toward him. "Dad," she whispered. Her voice broke. "Tell them that isn't true." He didn't answer. He just stared at the floor. And in that moment, Something invisible cracked open, across the entire room. If you've ever seen someone's perfect image collapse in real time, you know exactly how quiet it gets. Before we keep going, I want to say something quickly. If this story hits something real for you, subscribe for more stories like it. This space exists for stories like this. Now, let me tell you what happened next. Because that night didn't just expose a lie, it exposed 10 years of them. For a long moment, my father didn't move. The man who had just given a proud speech about sacrifice stood frozen behind the podium, his fingers gripping the edge so tightly his knuckles turned white. Every eye in the ballroom was on him. Madison took one shaky step closer. "Dad," she said again, quieter this time, "please say something." He looked up, not at her, at my grandmother. "Mom," he said hoarsely, "we talked about this." "No," she replied calmly. "You lied about this." The room shifted again, people leaning forward in their chairs. Conversations had completely died. Even the waitstaff had stopped moving. My mother stood abruptly. "This is ridiculous," she said sharply. "Eleanor, you're twisting things. We made decisions as parents." My grandmother didn't react to the accusation. Instead, she nodded once toward David. He pulled another document from the folder. "This," he said, holding it up, "is an amendment to the trust dated 3 months after Kora turned 18. I knew the paper before he even explained it. I had stared at it on my laptop screen weeks earlier. The forged amendment." Madison leaned over a table and grabbed one of the copies. "What does that mean?" she asked. David spoke carefully. "It authorizes the trustee Richard Thomas to distribute the funds at his discretion." "That's exactly what happened," my mother said quickly. But David wasn't finished. "This signature," he continued, tapping the bottom of the page, "is supposed to belong to Eleanor Thomas." My grandmother folded her hands in front of her. "It doesn't." David turned the page. "And this is Eleanor's verified signature from the same year. Even people without legal training could see it. The shapes were different. The pressure marks. The loops." Madison's eyes darted between the two pages. Then slowly, painfully, she looked up at my father. "You forged Grandma's name?" she whispered. My father finally spoke. His voice sounded smaller than I had ever heard it. "I did what I thought was best." A ripple of disbelief spread across the room. One of Madison's professors stood up. "Mr. Thomas," the woman said, her tone measured but sharp, "are we understanding correctly that the education funding for your daughter came from falsified trust documents?" Madison looked like someone had pulled the ground out from under her. "I didn't know," she said quickly. "I swear I didn't know." Across the ballroom, people were whispering now. Some shocked, some angry, some just stunned. My grandmother raised her hand slightly. The room quieted again. Then she said the 5 words that changed everything. "I'm pressing charges against you." The sentence landed like thunder. Madison's chair scraped loudly against the floor as she stood. My mother grabbed the back of it like she might collapse. My father didn't react at first. He just stared at his mother. Then his shoulders began to shake. Not with anger, with something else. Because the truth about that trust fund was only the beginning. And what David Brennan revealed next made the entire room realize this wasn't just family drama. It was a crime. My father's shoulders trembled, but David Brennan didn't pause. Years of courtroom experience had taught him something important. When the truth finally comes out, hesitation only gives lies time to regroup. He opened another folder. "There is additional information," he said calmly. My father closed his eyes. "David," he muttered, voice cracking, "please." But David continued. "During our review of the Thomas Family Education Trust, we discovered a second trust account connected to the same beneficiaries." A murmur rolled across the ballroom again. My Aunt Helen leaned forward from the table near the front. "Second trust?" she asked. David nodded. "Yes, established by Richard's father's first wife." He turned a page. $50,000 for each grandchild. Madison blinked. Wait, I never heard about that. My grandmother's voice was quiet. You weren't meant to. David looked down at the documents. That trust also lists Richard Thomas as acting trustee. A cold weight settled in my stomach. Even though I had already read the email weeks earlier, hearing it out loud was different. David continued. All funds from that account were also withdrawn over a 5-year period. He paused. Again, entirely directed toward Madison's education accounts. Another wave of whispers spread through the room. Someone near the back said under their breath, Jesus, that's another 100,000. My Aunt Helen stood slowly. Richard, she said, staring at my father. You stole from 2 separate trusts? My father finally broke. I was going to fix it, he shouted suddenly, his voice cracking across the ballroom. Every head snapped toward him. I was going to pay Kora back eventually. The words echoed against the high ceiling. My grandmother didn't flinch. You had 10 years. My father's face collapsed. I just wanted Madison to have every advantage, he said, almost pleading now. Kora was always fine. She always handled things. That sentence hit harder than anything else he had said. Because it was the truth. The ugly truth behind everything. They hadn't stolen the money because they hated me. They had stolen it because they believed I would survive without it. At table 11, Jake's hand tightened around mine. Are you okay? He whispered. I nodded slowly. But inside, something quiet had shifted. Across the ballroom, Madison looked like she couldn't breathe. My entire education, she murmured. Then she turned toward my father, tears streaking her mascara. You told me this was my money. You worked hard for it, he insisted weakly. With stolen money? She shot back. Silence filled the room again. That was when David Brennan spoke one more time. There is also evidence, he said carefully, that approximately $30,000 from these trusts was used for non-educational expenses. The room froze. My grandmother's voice turned cold. What kind of expenses? David flipped to the final page. Credit card balances. A pause. Vacation deposits. Another pause. And partial payment on a vehicle. My Aunt Helen whispered the thought everyone else was having. You didn't just steal for Madison. She looked straight at my father. You stole for yourself. Before we go further, I want to pause for just a moment. If you're listening to this story and thinking about a time someone finally told the truth in your life, tell me something. Would you have stood up in that room or stayed silent? And if you believe dignity matters more than appearances, you're in the right place. Because what happened next in that ballroom changed more than just my family. It changed everything Madison believed about her life. For a few seconds after David finished speaking, nobody said a word. The silence had changed. Earlier, it had been confusion. Now it was judgment. You could feel it moving through the room like a cold draft, people shifting in their chairs, whispering behind folded hands, glancing at my parents like they were suddenly strangers. My father looked smaller than I had ever seen him. Not physically, but the confidence he had worn his whole life, the certainty that he could control the story, was gone. Madison was still standing beside the podium. Her hands trembled as she clutched the edge of the table. You told me everything came from the college fund Grandma approved, she said slowly. My father wiped at his face. You needed the support. That's not what I asked. Her voice rose. Did you steal the money or not? My mother rushed forward, grabbing Madison's arm. Sweetheart, this isn't the time to talk about this. Madison pulled away. No, she said. Her voice shook, but she didn't sit down. Apparently, this is exactly the time. Across the room, people were already gathering their coats. Some were leaving quietly. Others stayed, unable to look away. One of Madison's professors stepped forward again, the same gray-haired woman who had questioned my father earlier. She looked down at the documents in her hand, then back up at Madison. Miss Thomas, she said carefully, did you have any knowledge of how your tuition was being funded? Madison's head snapped up. No, of course not. Her voice cracked. I thought it came from the family trust. The professor nodded slowly. That distinction may matter legally, she said. Then she paused. But ethically, this situation will need to be reviewed by the university. The words landed like a second explosion. Madison blinked. What does that mean? It means, the professor said gently, the school's ethics board will likely investigate the source of the funds used during your enrollment. Madison's face drained of color. You're saying my degree could be questioned? No, the professor replied quickly. You completed the academic work. She hesitated. But reputational consequences are another matter. Across the ballroom, someone whispered, "This is going to be all over the alumni network." Another voice added, "And the consulting firms." Madison turned slowly in a circle, suddenly aware that every person in the room now knew the same thing. Her perfect story had just collapsed. She looked at me then, for the first time all night. Her eyes were red and wide. "Kora," she said softly, "you knew about this?" I held her gaze. "Yes." My voice stayed calm. "I found out a few weeks ago." "Why didn't you tell me?" The question hung there between us. Because the honest answer was complicated. Because part of me didn't want to ruin her life. And part of me knew the truth was going to ruin it anyway. Before I could answer, my grandmother spoke again. "This was never Cora's burden to carry," she said firmly. "She carried enough already." Madison looked from my grandmother to my father, and finally back to me. And in that moment I could see something happening inside her. The slow realization that the life she had been celebrating all night had been built on something broken. If you've ever had a moment where the story you believed about your life suddenly changed, you know how terrifying that feels. Tell me something honestly. Would you want to know the truth right away, or would you rather never find out? Madison didn't sit down again. She just stood there in the middle of the ballroom, breathing like the air had suddenly gotten too thin. "I need you to tell me the truth," she said to my father. Her voice was quieter now, but somehow heavier. "Did you forge Grandma's signature?" My father rubbed his hands over his face. For years, he had been the kind of man who always had answers, quick explanations, confident justifications, neat little stories that made everything sound reasonable. But there were no neat stories left. Finally, he nodded. "Once." The room reacted instantly. A few people gasped. Someone whispered, "Oh my God." My mother grabbed his arm. "Richard, stop this," she hissed. "You're making it worse." But my father looked exhausted. Not just tonight. Exhausted from carrying something for 10 years. "Yes," he said hoarsely. "I signed it." Madison stared at him like she didn't recognize his face. "You told me Grandma changed the trust," she said. "I told you what you needed to hear," he replied. That sentence shattered something inside the room. Madison laughed once. A short, broken sound. "So my entire education was paid for with money you stole from my sister." My father's voice cracked again. "I was trying to give you the best chance. You took it from her." Her finger pointed toward me across the tables. For a moment, everyone turned to look. I hadn't moved since the speech started. I was still sitting at table 11. Still holding the same glass of water I had barely touched. Madison looked at me like she was seeing me properly for the first time in years. "You joined the military because of this?" she asked. I nodded. "Yes." Her shoulders sagged. "I thought you wanted to." I told myself I did. Jake squeezed my hand under the table. He had heard the full story weeks earlier. But hearing it out loud, in a room full of strangers, made it feel different. More real. Madison slowly sank back into her chair. "My God," she whispered. Around us, the social fallout was already spreading. Two of Madison's classmates stood and quietly left the ballroom. One of my father's business partners closed the folder in front of him and walked out without saying goodbye. At another table, someone muttered, "This is financial fraud." My grandmother remained perfectly calm. Her hands rested on the podium. Her voice, when she spoke again, was steady. "I want everyone here to understand something." The room went quiet. This was never about punishing anyone. She looked at me. then at my father. It was about correcting something that should never have happened. Before the night was over, the law would step in. But the real consequences had already begun. Because sometimes the hardest punishment isn't what happens in court. It's what happens when the truth finally walks into the room and refuses to leave. And that night, the truth wasn't finished speaking yet. The ballroom didn't recover after that. A celebration can survive a bad speech. It can survive an awkward moment. But it cannot survive the quiet spread of truth. People were leaving now in small clusters, whispering to each other as they gathered coats and purses. Some avoided eye contact with my parents. Others stared openly, curiosity replacing the polite smiles that had filled the room an hour earlier. Madison sat frozen in her chair. The elegant white dress, that had looked perfect under the stage lights, now seemed strangely out of place, like it belonged to someone else's life. My father had stepped away from the podium. He was standing near the bar, staring at the floor. My mother hovered beside him, speaking quickly in a low voice I couldn't hear. Across the room, my grandmother remained exactly where she had been, still, composed, completely certain of herself. Jake leaned closer to me. "Your grandmother," he murmured, "might be the calmest person I've ever seen in the middle of chaos." I almost smiled. "That's how she built a company with my grandfather," I said. "She never raises her voice." Jake watched the room for a moment. "Are you okay?" I took a breath. "Yes." And surprisingly, I meant it. Because for the first time in years, I wasn't the one carrying the secret. Madison suddenly stood again. Her chair scraped loudly across the floor. "I need some air," she said, her voice thin. But before she could leave, one of the professors who had been reviewing the documents stepped into her path. "Madison," the woman said gently. Madison stopped. "You should understand what's likely to happen next." Madison's hands trembled. "What do you mean?" "The university will need to review the funding situation," the professor explained. "That's standard procedure when financial misconduct is involved." Madison's face tightened. "But I didn't do anything." "I believe you," the professor said quietly. Then she added something that hung heavily in the air. "Unfortunately, reputations are fragile things." Madison swallowed hard. Across the ballroom, I could see the moment my father understood something too. This wasn't just about family anymore. This was about the world outside our house. Careers. Professional networks. Reputation. The kinds of things people spend entire lives building. And losing. Madison turned toward me again. Her eyes were red, but the anger that had flashed earlier was gone. Now there was only confusion. "Kora," she said softly. I waited. "Why didn't you fight back when this happened?" The question surprised me. Not because it was cruel, because it was honest. I thought about it for a second. Then I answered the only way I could. Because I believed them. The room felt smaller after I said it. Like something fragile had finally been spoken out loud. And maybe that's the hardest part of family betrayal. It's not just what they do. It's how long you believe their version of the story before you realize it was never true. Some of you listening right now probably know exactly what that feels like. And if you do, you're not wrong for feeling the way you do. Madison didn't respond right away. She just stared at me across the tables like she was trying to reconcile two completely different versions of her life. The one she had believed, and the one unfolding in front of everyone now. Finally, she said quietly, "I didn't know." "I believe you," I replied. And I did. Madison had been many things growing up, spoiled, protected, sometimes blind to the way our parents treated us differently. But she had never been cruel. She had simply accepted the version of reality that benefited her. That's a powerful kind of blindness. Across the ballroom, the country club manager approached my parents. He leaned toward my mother and spoke quietly. Even from where I sat, I could see the moment her face changed. Color drained from it instantly. "What do you mean the bill needs to be settled now?" she whispered sharply. The manager remained polite. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Thomas. Under the circumstances, the club requires immediate payment." Around them, People were pretending not to watch, but everyone was watching. My father fumbled for his wallet. The man who had always prided himself on control now looked like he couldn't keep up with the moment. Nearby, my Aunt Helen crossed the room and sat down beside me. "I knew something was wrong," she murmured, "but I never imagined it was this big." I nodded. "Neither did I." She glanced toward my father. "He always said you didn't need help." That was the problem. Jake shifted beside me. "Your grandmother just changed the entire story of this family," he said quietly. "No," I replied. "She just told the truth." At the front of the room, Madison's phone buzzed. She glanced down at it. Then again. Her expression tightened. "What is it?" one of her classmates asked. Madison swallowed. "That was my internship supervisor." The room seemed to lean closer. "What did they say?" the classmate asked. Madison hesitated. Then she spoke the words slowly. "They want to talk first thing Monday morning about ethical concerns." The phrase hung in the air. Everyone understood what it meant. Professional reputation spreads fast in business schools, especially scandals. Madison looked like she might cry again. Not loudly, just the quiet kind that comes when your future suddenly becomes uncertain. "I didn't even do anything," she whispered. I felt something twist in my chest. Because the truth was complicated. Madison hadn't forged the signature. She hadn't taken the money. But she had lived inside the benefits of it. And sometimes consequences don't stop to ask who knew what. Jake leaned closer to me. "How are you holding up?" I thought about the 6 years I had spent building a life from nothing. The nights studying after shifts. The student loans. The loneliness. Then I looked around the ballroom where the truth had finally caught up with everyone. "I'm strangely calm," I admitted. Jake nodded slowly. "Maybe that's what happens when you stop carrying someone else's lie." Maybe he was right. Because the truth once spoken doesn't belong to just one person anymore. It belongs to the room. And that night the room still hadn't heard everything. Because the most painful part of the story hadn't even happened yet. The ballroom was nearly half empty now. What had started as a celebration was slowly dissolving into something quieter, heavier. Chairs scraped across the floor as people left in careful clusters, whispering as they went. No one wanted to say the wrong thing, but everyone wanted to talk about it. Madison sat again at the edge of the stage, staring down at her phone like it might suddenly change the message she had already read. My father hadn't moved much either. He stood near the bar with both hands wrapped around a glass he hadn't touched. My mother kept pacing beside him, anger replacing the shock that had frozen her earlier. "You let this happen," she whispered harshly. "You should have handled it years ago." My father didn't respond. Across the room, my grandmother stepped down from the podium and slowly walked toward our table. The room seemed to make space for her as she passed. When she reached me, she rested one hand lightly on my shoulder. "Are you all right, sweetheart?" Her voice was soft again now, the way it used to sound when she tucked blankets around me during sleepovers as a kid. "I am," I said. And I realized something surprising as I said it. For the first time in years, I actually was. Jake stood politely. "Mrs. Thomas," he said, extending his hand. "Jake Morrison." "The young man who helped Kora ask the right questions," my grandmother said with a small smile. Jake looked slightly embarrassed. "I just asked one. It was the right one." She turned back to me. "I'm sorry it took so long," she said quietly. "For what?" "For realizing what your father had done." I shook my head. "You fixed it." "No," she corrected gently. "You were the one who finally asked." Across the ballroom, Madison slowly stood again. This time she walked directly toward us. Her eyes were red, but the anger from earlier had faded into something else. Something more uncertain. "Grandma," she said softly. My grandmother turned. Madison swallowed. "Did you really try to ask Dad about the trust before tonight?" "Yes." "How many times?" My grandmother didn't hesitate. 3. Madison closed her eyes briefly. So he lied to you too? Yes. Madison nodded slowly, absorbing that. Then she looked at me. I need to say something, she said. I'm listening. I'm sorry. The words came out fragile. Not polished. Not practiced. Just real. I didn't know, she continued. But I also didn't ask questions when things looked too easy. She rubbed her hands together nervously. That's on me. I studied her face. For the first time in years, Madison didn't look like the confident center of attention. She looked like someone trying to understand herself. That matters, I said quietly. Madison nodded once. Then she added something that surprised everyone at the table. I'm going to help pay it back. My grandmother blinked. The court won't require that. I know, Madison said. But it's still half my life that was funded by that money. She looked at me again. I don't expect forgiveness. I just want to start being honest. Moments like that are strange, because they don't erase the past, but they change the direction of the future. And sometimes that's enough to begin with. Before we keep going, I want to say something quickly. If stories like this resonate with you, stories about quiet strength, truth, and rebuilding dignity, subscribe for strength. This channel exists for people who know that real change doesn't happen in loud revenge. It happens in moments like this. Now, let me tell you what happened after the party ended. Because the legal consequences were only the beginning, the party ended without anyone officially saying it was over. There was no final toast, no music, no celebration photo. Just the slow, awkward unraveling of a room full of people who had arrived expecting champagne and speeches and were leaving after witnessing a family collapse in real time. Jake and I were among the last to walk out. Outside, the night air felt cooler than it should have. The country club parking lot was quiet except for a few distant engines starting as guests drove away. My parents were standing near their car. My father looked 10 years older than he had that morning. My mother looked furious. When she saw me, she marched straight across the parking lot. You're happy now? She snapped. Jake shifted slightly beside me but didn't say anything. I'm not happy, I said calmly. You destroyed this family tonight, she continued. The words came sharp and fast, like she had been holding them back for hours. You could have handled this privately. You didn't have to humiliate us in front of everyone. I felt something inside me settle. Not anger, just clarity. I didn't destroy anything, I said. You and Dad did that 10 years ago. She scoffed. Oh, please, we made a decision for the family. You stole from me. That's not how it happened. Yes, I replied quietly. It is. My father stepped forward then. Patricia, he said tiredly. Stop. For a moment she looked like she might argue. Then she threw up her hands and turned away. My father faced me. What do you want, Kora? His voice was smaller than I had ever heard it. Not defensive. Not proud. Just tired. I didn't answer immediately. Instead, I thought about the years that had led here. The night shifts. The student loans. The feeling of watching my own family celebrate someone else's life while mine happened quietly somewhere else. Then I said the only thing that mattered. I want what was taken from me. My father nodded slowly. David explained the settlement terms. $250,000. Plus interest. A 10-year repayment plan. It wasn't revenge. It was simply the law correcting something that should never have happened. We'll pay it, he said. My mother turned sharply. With what money? We'll figure it out. The irony of that sentence hung in the air between us. Because 6 years earlier, those were the same words they had given me. You'll figure it out. My father looked like he realized it too. He closed his eyes briefly. I'm sorry, he said. I believed that he meant it. But apologies are not the same as repair. I need time, I said quietly. Don't contact me for a while. My mother scoffed again. Oh, so now you're abandoning us? Jake opened the car door beside me. Kora isn't abandoning anyone, he said calmly. She's setting a boundary. I got into the passenger seat without answering. As Jake started the car, I glanced once in the rearview mirror. My father was standing under the parking lot light, shoulders slumped. My mother was already walking toward the car, still angry. And my grandmother was slowly crossing the lot toward them. Whatever she had to say next, they were going to hear it. Without me there. If you've ever had to walk away from people you love just to protect yourself, you know how complicated that moment feels. Tell me something honestly. Would you have stayed? Or done exactly what I did? The drive home was quiet. Not the uncomfortable kind of silence. The kind that follows something big when your mind is still trying to catch up with what just happened. Jake kept his eyes on the road. Streetlights passed across the windshield in slow intervals, casting brief gold flashes across the dashboard. After a few minutes, he glanced over at me. "How are you really doing?" I watched the dark streets outside. "Lighter," I said. Jake nodded like he understood exactly what I meant. Because he probably did. Anyone who's ever carried a truth alone for too long knows that strange relief when it finally belongs to the world instead of just you. When we reached my apartment, we sat in the parked car for a moment. "You handled that with a lot of dignity," Jake said. "I didn't do anything," I replied. "You did something important." "What?" "You stayed calm." I thought about that. For years, I had imagined what it would feel like to confront my parents. I thought I would be furious, explosive, maybe even cruel. But standing in that ballroom earlier, watching the truth unfold, I hadn't felt any of that. Just stillness. "Anger burns out eventually," I said. "What replaces it?" "Clarity." Jake smiled slightly. "That sounds like something your grandmother would say." I laughed quietly. She probably did. Inside my apartment, I kicked off my shoes and dropped onto the couch. For the first time that night, exhaustion hit me. My phone buzzed. A message from my grandmother. "Are you home safe?" I typed back. "Yes." A few seconds later, another message appeared. "Good. Tomorrow David will send the official settlement paperwork." I stared at the screen for a moment. It was strange seeing everything reduced to legal terms now. 10 years of quiet betrayal becoming numbers on a page. Jake sat down beside me. "So what happens next?" "The legal process starts," I said. "Restitution, court filings, payment plans." "And emotionally?" I shrugged slightly. "That part probably takes longer." My phone buzzed again. This time it was a message in the family group chat. "Madison, I'm sorry for tonight. I didn't know any of this." A second message followed. "But I should have asked questions." No one else responded. Not my parents. Not my aunt. Just silence. I stared at the message for a long time before typing back. "We'll talk later." Then I put my phone down. Jake leaned back on the couch. "You know something interesting about tonight?" "What?" "You didn't actually ruin anything." I raised an eyebrow. Pretty sure the country club would disagree. Jake shook his head. "No, the lies ruined it." He looked at me. "You just stopped protecting them." Some of you listening right now probably know exactly how hard that step is. Because the moment you stop protecting someone's lies, everything changes. And for me, the biggest changes were only beginning. Because 3 weeks later, the legal process officially started. And that's when the consequences became real. 3 weeks after the party, I sat in a conference room across from my parents for the first time. The courthouse building was quiet in the way government buildings always are: neutral walls, fluorescent lights, the faint echo of footsteps in distant hallways. Nothing about it felt dramatic, which somehow made the moment heavier. David Brennan sat beside me with a stack of neatly organized documents. Across the table, my father looked smaller than I remembered. His shoulders had curved inward, like the weight of the past month had been slowly pressing down on him. My mother sat rigid beside him, arms folded tightly. She still hadn't spoken to me directly since the night of the party. David adjusted his glasses. "Before we begin," he said calmly, I want to clarify that today's purpose is to finalize the civil settlement agreement. He slid a document across the table. My father stared at it without touching it. $250,000, David continued. That includes the original trust amount owed to Kora, plus interest. The number sat on the page like a quiet verdict. My father nodded slowly. We understand. My mother finally spoke. And if we refuse? David didn't raise his voice. Then the criminal charges proceed in full. The room went silent. Forgery. Embezzlement. Fraud. None of those words had been spoken out loud in this room yet. But they were all sitting there with us. My father picked up the pen. His hand shook slightly. You know, he said quietly without looking up, I kept telling myself I was helping the family. He signed his name. I told myself Kora was strong enough to figure things out. The pen scratched across the paper. I told myself Madison needed it more. He finished signing and slid the document back toward David. Then he finally looked at me. And the worst part, he said softly, is that I believed those things. I held his gaze. For the first time, he wasn't defending himself. He was simply admitting the truth. David flipped through the paperwork quickly. 10-year repayment schedule, he said, $2,800 per month. My mother's jaw tightened. That will take everything we have. David nodded once. Yes. My father didn't argue. He just leaned back in his chair. Consequences usually do. I signed my portion next. The moment my name hit the paper, the legal process was complete. The money would start coming back. But as I sat there looking at my parents across the table, I realized something important. The money wasn't the hardest part of this story. Trust was. And trust doesn't come with a payment plan. Some of you listening right now know exactly what that feels like. Before we continue, there's something I want to say. If you believe quiet strength matters, if you believe dignity is worth protecting, even when it's painful, this is your space. Subscribe. Because stories like this aren't really about money. They're about learning when to stand up for yourself. And the next chapter of this story was about what happens after the truth settles in. The first payment arrived on a Tuesday morning. I was sitting at my small kitchen table with a cup of coffee and my laptop open when the notification popped up from my bank. Deposit, $2,800. For a few seconds, I just stared at the screen. It wasn't a life-changing amount of money. Not really. But it represented something that had been missing for a long time. Acknowledgement. Jake walked into the kitchen a few minutes later, still tying his work tie. You look like you just saw a ghost, he said. First payment came in. He leaned over my shoulder and looked at the screen. 2,800. Every month for 10 years, I said. Jake nodded slowly. That's a lot of reminders. Yeah. I closed the laptop. I'm transferring it straight into an investment account. You're not going to use it for anything? Not yet. I thought about the 6 years I spent paying off student loans. The night shifts. The classes after work. The feeling of always being one step behind financially. This money doesn't feel like income, I explained. It feels like returned property. Jake considered that for a moment. Fair. I transferred the payment into the account and closed the tab. For the rest of the morning, I tried to focus on work. But my mind kept drifting. Because even though the legal side of things had been settled, the emotional side was still complicated. Around noon, my phone buzzed. A message from Madison. I heard the settlement was finalized. I stared at the text for a while, before replying. Yes. A few seconds later, another message appeared. I meant what I said at the party. I want to help pay it back. I leaned back in my chair. Jake glanced over from the other side of the room. Everything okay? Madison. What about her? She wants to contribute to the repayment. Jake raised an eyebrow. That's unexpected. Yeah. I read the message again. There was no defensiveness in her words. No attempt to minimize what had happened. Just, Responsibility. I typed back slowly. The court didn't require that. Her response came almost immediately. I know. Then another. But half that money supported my life. I stared at the screen. For most of our childhood, Madison had never questioned anything that benefited her. Now, she was doing the opposite. Jake walked over and leaned against the kitchen counter. So what are you going to say? I don't know yet. And that was the honest truth. Because forgiveness isn't a switch you flip. It's something that grows slowly, if it grows at all. Some of you listening have probably experienced that moment when someone finally takes responsibility, long after the damage is done. And you're left wondering what to do with it. That's exactly where I was sitting that afternoon. Trying to decide what accountability really looks like when the truth finally catches up with everyone. 2 days later, I agreed to meet Madison. We chose a quiet coffee shop halfway between our apartments. Neutral ground felt safer for both of us. When I walked in, she was already there. No designer clothes this time, just jeans, a gray sweater, and her hair pulled back in a loose knot. For someone who had spent years looking effortlessly polished, she suddenly looked tired. Real. She stood when she saw me. Thanks for coming. I sat across from her. You said you wanted to talk. Madison nodded and slid a folded piece of paper across the table. I made a plan. I unfolded it. A simple spreadsheet. Her salary from the consulting firm she had managed to keep after the internship fallout, monthly expenses, and a line at the bottom. $500 per month, repayment to Kora. I looked up. You don't have to do this. I know, she said. That's why I want to. Her fingers wrapped around her coffee cup. For years I told myself the reason Mom and Dad favored me was because I needed more help, she continued quietly. She met my eyes. But the truth is, I benefited from something that hurt you. The cafe hummed softly around us, espresso machines, quiet conversations, dishes clinking. Madison pushed the paper closer. I'm not trying to erase the past, she said. I just want my part of the future, to be honest. I folded the sheet slowly. I'm not ready for everything to go back to normal. I know. There was no argument in her voice. Just acceptance. Sometimes healing doesn't begin with forgiveness. Sometimes it begins with someone finally telling the truth about their role in the story. And that morning, for the first time in a long time, my sister and I were starting to speak honestly. Madison didn't rush the conversation. After I folded the paper and set it on the table, she didn't push it back toward me or ask if I was going to accept it. She just sat there, letting the moment breathe. That was new. Growing up, Madison had always been quick to fill silence with explanations, excitement, or whatever emotion fit the moment. Sitting quietly had never been her strength. I started therapy, she said after a minute. I looked up. That was probably a good idea. She gave a small, tired smile. My therapist said something last week that stuck with me. What was that? That favoritism doesn't only hurt the child who gets less, she said. It also distorts the child who gets more. I leaned back slightly. That sounds about right. Madison nodded. For years I thought I earned everything because Mom and Dad told me I did. She traced the rim of her coffee cup. But when people keep clearing the path in front of you, you stop checking where the road came from. Neither of us spoke for a few seconds. Then she asked something carefully. Do you hate me? The question didn't feel dramatic. It felt honest. I thought about it before answering. No. She let out a breath she had probably been holding all morning. But that doesn't mean everything is okay, I added. I know. We sat there for another few minutes, talking about small things, her new job, my work in logistics, the awkward silence that still hung over family group chats. Nothing magical happened. No emotional breakthrough. Just two people slowly learning how to speak without the old roles guiding every word. When we finally stood up to leave, Madison hesitated. I'll start sending the $500 next month, she said. You don't need my permission. I know. She paused at the door. but I'd like to earn your respect again someday. I nodded once. Respect isn't given in a single conversation. It's built slowly, over time. And for the first time in years, my sister and I were both starting from the same place. Honesty. 3 months passed quietly. The legal payments from my parents arrived every month like clockwork, $2,800 deposited on the same day, then transferred straight into the investment account I had set up. Madison kept her promise too. $500 appeared at the end of each month with a short note in the transfer description. For what was yours? No long messages. No emotional speeches. Just consistency. And strangely, that meant more than apologies ever could. During that time, I focused on something else, rebuilding the life that had been delayed. The first thing I did was pay off the last of my student loans. $23,000 gone with one payment. I stared at the confirmation screen for a long time after it cleared. For 6 years, that number had followed me everywhere. Now it didn't. Jake came home that evening and found me sitting at the kitchen table smiling at my laptop. Good news? He asked. Student loans are officially gone. He broke into a grin. That deserves dinner somewhere better than leftovers. Maybe he was right. Because something important had changed. For the first time since I was 18, my future didn't feel like something I had to survive. It felt like something I could finally start building. About 6 months after Madison's graduation party, I started thinking about something I hadn't allowed myself to consider before. What to do with the future. Not just paying bills. Not just surviving month to month. Something bigger. The idea came during one of the veterans support meetings Jake had convinced me to attend when I first came home from service. At the time, I mostly listened. That night, a younger woman named Carla spoke up. I feel invisible now, she said quietly. When I was deployed, everything I did mattered. Now I'm sending out resumes and nobody even calls back. The room was silent. I understood exactly what she meant. When I got home from the military, I had felt the same way, like my entire life experience suddenly didn't translate to the civilian world. After the meeting, Jake caught up with me in the hallway. You're thinking about something, he said. I want to help people like us, I admitted. How? A mentorship program, something that helps veterans transition into civilian careers. Jake nodded slowly. That sounds like you. The next morning, I opened my laptop and started researching nonprofit registrations. If the money my parents stole had originally been meant to support education and opportunity, then maybe the best way to reclaim it was to make sure it actually did. 3 months later, the paperwork was finished. The nonprofit had a name now. The Thomas Education Initiative. I chose the name carefully. Not because of my father. Because of my grandfather. The man who had originally built the trust so both of his granddaughters would have a fair start. Jake helped me set up the first meeting in a borrowed conference room at the Veterans Center downtown. I expected maybe 5 people. 12 showed up. Some were recently discharged. Others had been out of the military for years but still felt stuck between 2 worlds. We talked about resumes first. Then job interviews. Then something deeper. How do you explain leadership from deployment to someone who's only worked in an office? One man asked. A woman across the table nodded. Or how do you explain trauma without sounding unstable? The conversations lasted almost 2 hours. No one rushed to leave. When the meeting ended, Jake pulled me aside. You realize something, right? What? You just turned something that hurt you into something that helps other people. I looked back at the room as the last few veterans gathered their coats. Maybe he was right. Because the money that had once been stolen from my future was finally starting to create new ones. 18 months after Madison's graduation party, my life looks very different. The restitution payments still arrive every month. I barely think about them anymore. They move automatically into the investment account, slowly rebuilding something that should never have been taken in the first place. The Thomas Education Initiative now mentors more than 50 veterans a year. What started as 12 people in a borrowed room has grown into workshops, career connections, and a network of people who understand what it means to come home and feel invisible. My grandmother attends the meetings sometimes. She sits quietly in the back row, listening. After one session, she squeezed my hand and said, "Your grandfather would have loved this." That meant more to me than any amount of money. Things with my family are complicated but honest. My father and I meet for dinner once a month. We talk carefully, rebuilding trust one small conversation at a time. He never misses a payment. My mother still struggles with everything that happened. Some people take longer to face the truth. Madison and I speak every few weeks now. Not like the sisters you see in holiday photos, but like two adults learning who each other really are. And that's enough. Because the biggest lesson I learned from all of this is simple. Peace doesn't come from pretending nothing happened. It comes from finally telling the truth and then building something better afterward. If this story meant something to you, remember one thing. You're allowed to protect your dignity, even when the people who hurt you share your last name. And if that idea matters to you, join where dignity stands. Subscribe. Also, before you go, tell me something in the comments. What would you have done in my place? Sometimes hearing each other's stories reminds us we're not alone,